This is the story of the morgue attendant's double shift. The basement was always the quietest, and simultaneously the most chilling part of St. Jude Hospital. It was my territory. I'm Mike, a night shift cleaner, and my job was to keep the morgue sanitary. People used to joke it was the easiest work. The dead don't make messes, Mike. But I knew better. It wasn't the mess you worried about. It was the absolute, crushing silence and the deep, pervasive cold that got to you. It frayed your nerves. It made you acutely aware of every faint whir of the ventilation, every soft tick of the aging industrial machinery. Tonight felt especially desolate. Around 11, the porters brought down just a single body, an elderly man named Randall who'd passed away from a cardiac event. I logged the paperwork, wheeled him into the main prep room, and gently slid his body into drawer number 3. All the other storage compartments were empty. The funeral homes had collected everyone else hours ago. It was just Mr. Randall and me in the refrigerated crypt. I retreated to my small windowed office, switched on the dim desk lamp, and pulled up a chess app on my phone. I told myself I would simply wait out the hours until the first streaks of dawn reclaimed the night. 15 minutes later, I glanced up. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and then I saw it. Drawer number 3 was ajar. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew with absolute certainty that I had secured the latch. I am meticulous about those latches. I sighed, trying to rationalize it as a mechanical failure. The old hospital equipment giving up the ghost, so to speak. I stood, my joints cracking in the cold, and walked over to the metallic wall. I pulled the drawer shut with a solid clunk and meticulously engaged the safety lock. "Sorry about that, Mr. Randall," I muttered, feeling foolish even as a wave of irrational unease washed over me. My back began to prickle with cold sweat, despite the room temperature hovering near 40°F. I returned to my desk and tried to recapture my concentration, forcing myself to ignore the creeping sense that the silence had grown too heavy, too deliberate. Perhaps 5 minutes passed when I looked up again. This time, there was no doubt. Drawer number 3 had reopened. It wasn't just slightly open. It had slid out a good 4 inches, enough for me to clearly see the white outline of the shroud. The entire room was thick with shadows, only sparsely illuminated by the weak light spilling from my office window. The chill I felt was no longer merely the climate control. It was something deeper, more primal. I had the terrifying sensation that dozens of unseen eyes were watching me from the corners of the room, tracking my every involuntary twitch. I stood, feeling a strange, unnatural weight pressed down on my shoulders. I knew I should simply run, but some twisted professional obligation, or maybe pure paralysis, held me. I scanned the empty hallway. The gurneys were lined up like silent sentinels, but there was no one. Just me and the body of Mr. Randall, or perhaps whatever was currently occupying his space. I walked slowly toward the drawer, my fingers shaking as I reached for the handle. I slammed the door back into the wall, the metal screeching in protest, and locked it perfectly. I checked the latch again, running my thumb over the mechanism. It was locked. I stood there for a full minute, mentally daring the drawer to move again. As I turned my back to retreat, the sound happened. It wasn't a whisper, not a moan, but a deafening, physical explosion of noise. Bam! A heavy steel door at the far end of the corridor, leading to the old storage closet, was violently thrown against the wall. The sound echoed through the basement like a thunderclap. I nearly collapsed. Every rational part of my brain screamed flee, but my legs were anchors, bolted to the concrete floor. I slowly spun around, clinging desperately to the doorframe of my office, fighting for breath. It wasn't breathing. It was uncontrolled, gasping hyperventilation. When my eyes swept toward the main prep table, I saw a blurry shape lying on the stainless steel surface. It was another body, a woman, wrapped in a brittle, dirty grey shroud, was resting on the examination table, which had been perfectly bare moments before. I knew it was bare because I had wiped it down myself. This wasn't Mr. Randall. Sheer terror had turned my mind into a static void. I fumbled and dropped my radio onto the floor, where it bounced with a pathetic clatter. I couldn't comprehend how a second corpse had materialized out of thin air. I stared at the exposed bare foot poking out from the bottom of the shroud and the faded brown toe tag tied to the big toe. I didn't have to get close to read the smudged handwriting, but the date was unmistakably clear. 1994. It was 2016. How could a body from over 2 decades ago be resting on a modern prep table in a hospital morgue where turnaround time was mandatory within 48 hours? And more pressingly, how did it get there? I was close to passing out. I grabbed the dead radio from the floor, my fingers fumbling with the security channel button. My voice was a choked, alien croak, but I managed to stammer out the only word that mattered. Morgue. Help. B. Body. The next 5 minutes stretched into an eternity. I refused to take my eyes off the table. Then I heard the distinct sound of footsteps echoing from the main service corridor. Mike, what's going on down here? A security guard named John appeared. He was a large, gruff man who'd worked night shifts for years. Seeing John provided a desperate, fleeting sense of relief. John, look, the body. It shouldn't be here. I pointed a shaking finger at the table. John stepped into the room, his face etched with confusion. He looked at the corpse, then at the toe tag. What the 1994? Mike, are you hallucinating? Is this some sick prank? He approached the body. I felt marginally better just having another witness to this unfolding insanity. John leaned down to inspect the tag, his back momentarily turned to me. He frowned, muttering something about calling the police department. It was then I heard a small, hissing sound, like a tiny burst of cold air being abruptly inhaled. I glanced away for just a split second, looking toward the far wall. When I looked back, John was standing upright, looking directly at me. Where did he go? I asked. Who? John replied, his voice unnervingly flat. I looked back at the prep table. It was empty. The brittle grey shroud, the 1994 toe tag, all gone. The body, the woman's body, it was right here. You just saw it. I was hysterical. John slowly shook his head. Mike, I don't see anything. This room is empty. You must be severely overtired. I lunged toward the cold storage unit. No, Mr. Randall. Check drawer number 3. I threw the latch and pulled the drawer open. It was empty. The body of Mr. Randall, the man who had died just hours ago, was completely gone. In its place, folded neatly on the cold metal floor of the compartment, lay a clean set of hospital scrubs. I spun around, ready to scream at John, to force him to see the impossible truth. But John was gone. I ran out into the corridor, calling his name. John, John." There was no reply, only the echo of my voice against the concrete walls. I grabbed the radio from the floor, intending to call the switchboard, but when I pressed the button, it only emitted a dead, meaningless static hiss. I glanced down at the device, and that's when I saw it. The radio had no battery pack installed. I stood frozen, staring at the inert object in my hand. Who had spoken to me? Who had answered my desperate call? Who was the big, gruff man who had stood beside me, examining a non-existent body from 1994? The terrifying realization struck me as I looked back at the gurney John had been leaning against. There were no dust marks disturbed on the metallic rails. I had been answered by a spirit, an entity, that had materialized to play the role of the security guard, lulling me into a false sense of security. And now, it had taken both bodies with it. I fled the basement that night, never looking back. I never returned to work at St. Jude, but the cold, heavy feeling never left me. Since that night, I've always felt a strange, inexplicable weight on my back, a clinging presence that I can't shake. I don't know which soul took the night shift as the attendant that evening, but I know one thing for sure. It found a replacement, and that replacement was me. This is the story of the knocking from the cold drawers. People say the morgue is the most peaceful place in the hospital. It's where everything stops, where the frenetic energy of the ER and the raw grief of the ICU finally settle. But that's only what people say who have never had to work down here at 3 a.m. I'm Alex. I've been a morgue and funeral home technician for over 20 years. I've seen things most people couldn't stomach, and I grew accustomed to viewing bodies as simply matter to be preserved and processed. You have to build a wall. You have to believe that death is a permanent disconnect. Otherwise, you don't last in this line of work. But one night, that wall didn't just crack. It utterly crumbled. It was a typical Friday night. A persistent drizzle tapped softly against the basement window well, providing the only mournful sound cutting through the pervasive stillness of the cooling systems. I was working alongside Dr. Elias, the hospital's veteran pathologist. He was a quiet, unflappable man who had dedicated his life to dissecting the cold, hard truths of mortality. Elias was preparing for an early morning post-mortem, while I was across the room, inventorying and rearranging the cold storage drawers. We worked in near total silence. There was only the steady, monotonous hum of the chilling unit and the soft flick of Elias turning papers. The air is always cold, but that night it felt unnaturally thick, heavy, as if something other than just air and moisture filled the space. I was standing in front of Bay B, our oldest, most rusted bank of refrigerators. We rarely use those drawers anymore. But tonight, drawer B7 contained a man in his 50s, an unidentified, non-witnessed death, waiting for police clearance. I was checking its seal when I heard the sound. It was a thin, sharp knock. Talk. I straightened up. It could be machinery. It could be pressure building. The refrigeration system could generate eerie sounds as metal contracted. I glanced back at Elias, but he remained hunched over, absorbed in his notes. I resumed my task, consciously dismissing the noise. A minute passed. This time, the knock came clearer, sounding more deliberate. Talk, talk. It originated directly from Baby. A cold sweat began to seep through my scrubs. This wasn't pressure. This wasn't metal warping. The sound was too precise, too uniform. It sounded exactly like a fingernail tapping against a metallic surface. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to remain calm. Dr. Elias? He didn't look up. Yes, Alex. Did you hear that? Elias finally raised his head. His look wasn't annoyance or drowsiness. It was a strange, hollow coldness I'd never seen from him before. He looked straight into my eyes, said nothing, and slowly set his pen down. Just then, the knock came again, this time louder, more decisive. Tock, 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 and it was definitely coming from drawer B7. The drawer holding the unknown man. My entire body went rigid. I felt the blood drain from my face. Despite 20 years on the job, this was new territory. Hospital ghost stories, whispers of unsettled souls. I'd always been the one to debunk them. But this knock, it felt too real, too physical to be a mere figment of imagination. Where is it coming from? Elias's voice was a deep rasp, barely a whisper. B7, I choked out. The unidentified man. I think he's alive. The horrifying truth flashed through my mind. They can come back. Catatonia, deep hypothermia, or what we morbidly call Lazarus syndrome. Spontaneous circulatory return after cardiac arrest. Rare, but not impossible. Could this man have been pronounced too soon, and was now desperately trying to knock his way out of that cold steel box? The thought of a living man trapped in a refrigerated morgue drawer, gulping for thin, icy air, knocking for salvation, sent my fear soaring to a physical peak. I have to open it, I declared, starting to move toward baby. It was my duty. Emergency protocol trumps everything. Don't. Elias's voice wasn't raised, wasn't a shout. It was so cold and absolute that I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned back to him. Dr. Elias was standing upright now. He stared at me without blinking. We checked him, twice. Flatline ECG. No reflexes. He is dead, Alex. But the knocking. Do not open that drawer. Elias took a single step closer. You don't want to know what is knocking. Tock, 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 tock. The knocking had become faster now, more frantic, sounding like the person inside was losing all hope. The metal contact sounded less like tapping and more like a desperate scratching against the confines of life. He could be alive. It could be Lazarus, I insisted, feeling the sweat now clammy under my arms. I felt the crushing weight of responsibility. If I didn't open that door, I would be a murderer. Elias moved up to me, placing his ice-cold hand on my shoulder. Listen to me, Alex. The dead do not knock. Whatever is strong enough to pound that metal like that, it is not a person trying to get back in. He spoke low, almost conspiratorially, forcing me to lean in to hear him. I did it once, he whispered. Years ago. I opened the drawer when they knocked. It was a young woman. When I pulled the tray out, she was looking at me, not the gaze of a living person. Her eyes were wide, white, but I could see awareness in them. Not the awareness of a woman waking up, but the awareness of a person who had been dragged back. She didn't want to come back, but she was forced to knock. He gripped my shoulder tighter. It doesn't want salvation. It wants inclusion. By opening the door, you acknowledge its presence, and you invite it out. Tock, 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 tock. The knocking was now frantic, furious, a relentless clamor against the steel interior. I stood paralyzed, barely breathing, staring at the abused cold drawer. What could I do? How could I live with the thought of a living person pleading for help? But then I recalled Elias's words. It doesn't want salvation. It wants inclusion. I pictured the young woman Elias described, the blank eyes forced to see. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the temperature, but everything to do with the acknowledgement that some things superseded our medical knowledge. We stood there, two professional, grown men, forced into inaction, while a terrifying sound continued to assail us from inside a metal box. Finally, after an immeasurable stretch of time, the knocking ceased. Just as suddenly as it began, the room settled into an overwhelming, stifling silence. Even the hum of the cooling unit seemed subdued. We stood there, waiting. Several minutes, 10 minutes. Nothing. Elias finally released me. His hand was freezing. "It sleeps now," he whispered. "Who?" I croaked. He turned back to his desk, picking up his pen. "What the police will call cause of death." The next morning, I was still shell-shocked. When I opened drawer B7 to transfer the body, I was prepared for the worst. Maybe scratches on the shroud or bruises on the dead man's fingertips. But there was nothing. The man's body lay still, no evidence of struggle or attempted escape. The shroud was completely intact. I logged my night shift record. No incidents reported. I couldn't log the truth. I couldn't carry the liability of that truth. However, there was one small detail that haunted me forever. When I flipped over the identification card beneath the man's name, I saw a small notation written in Dr. Elias's sharp handwriting. "Do not open. Internal noise noted. Non-vital." I never asked Elias about the woman he opened the door for, and I never dared to venture near Bay B again after 10 o'clock at night. I still work in the morgue. I still maintain that professional wall. But now I know it's not entirely solid, and every time I hear the metal warp and groan in the dark, a part of me recoils, remembering the knocking in the drawer isn't a plea for life. It's an invitation to death. This is the story of the neonatal nurse's elevator. My name is David, and I work in patient transport. In a hospital, we are the invisible ones, pushing gurneys, rushing specimens, transferring charts. And sometimes, we are the ones literally navigating the line between life and death, responsible for taking the deceased down to the morgue in the basement. I was only 23. I always prided myself on being a realist, a guy who didn't believe in ghosts or anything that couldn't be explained by biology or physics. But this story forced me to accept that in a place like St. Benedict's Hospital, where birth and death happen daily, the laws of physics are sometimes just invitations for exceptions. My shift started typically enough. Around 9 p.m., I got a call from the intensive care unit, ICU, on the 6th floor. A patient had expired. Normally, we wait for the funeral home transport, but the family had left, and another emergency admission urgently needed the room. The charge nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, called me with an urgent tone, asking for immediate assistance moving the body. "The main mortuary transport team is tied up," she told me. "David, I know you're strong enough. Help me out this one time." I agreed immediately. I needed the overtime pay. When I arrived on the 6th floor, the room was cleared. Mrs. Rodriguez was standing next to the gurney holding the body. The deceased was fully wrapped in a thick, white shroud. She was an elderly woman who had battled multiple sclerosis, MS, for years and had finally passed peacefully. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me secure the toe tag, and we wheeled the gurney out. Hospital protocol dictates that body transport must use the service elevator, keeping it discreetly out of public view. The service elevator in the ICU wing was an old, narrow metal box tucked away down a dim service corridor. We maneuvered the gurney inside. It fit with only inches to spare. I thanked Mrs. Rodriguez and pushed the B button for the basement. It was just me and the wrapped body in the elevator car. The moment the doors hissed shut and the elevator began its descent, I knew something was profoundly wrong. The gurney, by my estimation, should have felt light. The woman was frail, and the shroud added minimal weight. Yet, as the elevator began to move downward, I felt a terrible, immense drag on the wheels. It was so heavy that the casters seemed to momentarily sink into the rubber floor mat. I had to brace my shoulder against the gurney to keep it stable, preventing it from rolling into the steel wall. What the hell is this? I frowned. I had effortlessly pushed 300-pound men before, without this kind of resistance. The heaviness didn't feel like physical weight. It felt like an unseen force of resistance. It was as if someone or something was clinging tightly to the opposite side of the gurney and struggling against my push. I could feel the muscles in my arms and back tensing just to keep the gurney from shifting violently. The elevator descended at a crawl. Ding, ding, ding. The floor chimes sounded with agonizing regularity, each chime punctuating my rising panic. When we reached floor 5, the elevator stopped abruptly. No one had pushed the button. The doors slid open to an empty, sickly yellow-lit hallway. I checked the panel. No buttons were lit. I slammed the B button again. The doors closed, and the elevator resumed its slow, agonizing journey down. As it passed floor 4, the heaviness peaked. The gurney felt as though it had been nailed to the floor. I had to grit my teeth and exert all my weight onto the handlebars to keep hold of it. I could hear the metal groaning in the elevator shaft, not from motion, but from pressure. In my mind, a chilling whisper seemed to cut through the quiet. Let go. I didn't know why, but I was certain that if I released my grip, the gurney would be violently ripped from my hands and smashed into the wall. After what felt like an eternal few seconds, the crushing weight suddenly eased slightly, and the elevator resumed its downward course. I gasped for breath, sweat beading on my forehead. My arms were trembling. When we reached the basement, I couldn't believe it when the doors opened. I shoved the gurney out of the elevator, and the instant it cleared the threshold, the weight completely vanished. The gurney instantly felt light again, gliding easily as if it contained nothing but air. I quickly completed the transfer protocol in the morgue, desperate to shake the lingering cold dread. When I returned to the ICU to report the delivery, I related the experience to Mrs. Rodriguez. I didn't mention spirits or ghosts. I simply talked about the weird weight and the elevator stopping. I was searching for a mechanical or engineering explanation. Mrs. Rodriguez listened, her eyes growing distant. She was an older nurse, one who had seen more weird things than I could possibly imagine. When I finished, she leaned against the counter, looking at me with an expression of profound pity. "David," she said softly, "the patient you just moved, that was Nurse Sharon. She was the head neonatal nurse here back in the 80s. I nodded, waiting for the connection. She worked on floor 4, Mrs. Rodriguez continued. She loved that job. She had to quit when the MS got too bad. She never wanted to leave. Sharon always said she'd never truly leave the 4th floor. A cold wave of realization washed over me. That service elevator, she said, her voice dropping lower. It doesn't stop on the 5th floor unless someone presses it, but it always stops at the 4th floor, whether someone calls it or not. She looked at me intently. Where did you feel the absolute worst of the wait, David? On floor 4, I admitted, my throat tight. As we passed the 4th floor, Mrs. Rodriguez nodded gently. Sharon was trying to take the elevator home. Her spirit was clinging to her own gurney, trying desperately to reach the 4th floor one last time. She added, Nurse Sharon was a wonderful woman. She meant you no harm. She was just lost and couldn't accept that she couldn't get back up there. Since that night, I've never looked at the bodies I transport as just matter. Every time I step into that service elevator, especially that one, I feel a light, cold pressure on my shoulder. I never told anyone outside of the night staff the full story. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy. But I couldn't forget the crushing feeling of having to use all my young strength to hold a gurney containing a frail, deceased woman. It wasn't physical weight. It was the weight of a trapped soul, desperately clinging to its last cherished place. And I know that every time that elevator stops on the 4th floor in the middle of the night, with nobody calling it, it's not a malfunction. It's Nurse Sharon checking to see if her floor is ready for her return.